Good morning, Greg. We did it eventually. I think we did it. It's, this is different, and frankly, we've had a hard time focusing all morning so far. So, I mean, we've gotten this far, so it can't be all that bad. But for some reason, Google support just popped up, too. Yay. All right. So, good morning, everybody in the chat, and welcome. Oh, there was one person that said good morning. Actually, to quote, they said morning, everybody, with the explanation point. But I don't think an explanation is required for good morning. Yes. All those things are true statements, I can confirm. Mm-hmm. Yep, thoroughly. I mean, I don't know. It's one of those topics that Greg is muted, is it? It says you're sending audio. Oh, one sec. No, it's on the stream. We don't like this. We're trying new things, and for some reason, okay, I'm gonna switch channels. Big Greg. The other thing. No, they can't. I'm gonna click all the buttons, guys. I'm gonna click every single button. Okay, hold on. Do the thing on the other thing, Greg. No, do the thing on the other thing. Call me back on the other thing. Well, you don't have audio, and it says you have audio, so I don't know. Like, it says it's going out. Reboot. No, we can't reboot. Okay, let me explain. If we reboot, everything goes away. Everything. All of our. No, I'm just kidding. It might reconnect. It depends how long. I'm not sure why Greg's audio isn't going out, but let's just bonk. You need video. Send me your video.
I am. I'm working on that.
He's sending video right now, everybody.
I'm attempting to.
Do. Every time we try this. So we're trying to get Greg's video better is what it is. And it should have been sending, but it did not.
Apparently,
and he's still trying to connect the other way. So anyway, while he's doing that, I'm going to click a button, and I'm going to talk over and do the thing.
I think I'm here.
Panda now, everybody. Okay, now let's see if you have audio. Talk a bunch.
A bunch. Thanks everyone who's on this list. You are great, and thank you so much for joining us on Patreon.
Yeah, okay, he has audio now. Okay.
Yay!
Okay. Now, loud and clear. Isn't that what caused the problem? Just clicking a button. Actually, in this case, it fixed the problem. I'm a big proponent of clicking buttons, though.
Oh, Dave is the professional button clicker of the universe. So
if it doesn't break it, I'm clicking it.
That's why his videos are always so good, because he clicks every button and explains how every button works.
If there's a button, we have to find out what it does. All right. The suspense, though. The suspense is killing me, Greg. I can't handle the suspense. So, we're going to start into our Marlin Klipper
series.
Yes. The series. So a good place to start would be kind of, well, obviously at the beginning. But from the beginning is an interesting thing. So, I mean, I guess we'll start chronologically speaking. So Marlin firmware,
Yes.
Marlin firmware was originally made for one 8-bit microcontrollers,
Yes.
and it was made by Ultimaker.
Yeah.
Like,
RepRap and Ultimaker printers.
so,
Well, it was made for Ultimaker.
yeah, it was made
I don't know.
for Ultimaker.
I don't know if it was made by Ultimaker.
By Eric van der Zalm. I think I said that right. Anyway, so Marlin came about at just at the beginning of the last decade. See how I did that?
Whoa, that's pretty good. 2011.
Yes. So 2011. So like, as far as things go, Marlin's like what, 12 years old now. So it's a little bit older when it comes to firmware, but I would argue that there's two phases of Marlin.
Yeah.
Right. And there's also two version releases to go with those phases, right? So we had the Marlin that was good to run on like a microcontroller, so like an Arduino with a Ram's hat.
Yep.
Basically.
Well, that's its origin, yeah,
right?
for sure.
An 8-bit controller. So that's kind of like the beginnings of Marlin. It was to take your dumb frame of a 3D printer. 3D printing frames are not smart by nature. They are motors and a print bed, and that's it, right? And so then we used this very basic version of Marlin, right? And when I say basic, it was basic. It had controller stepper support for just enough stepper drivers.
But wasn't it C++ and not BASIC?
Nope. Yes, you are right, but it wasn't basic. I'm not going there. And so that's the other big difference too when we get talking about Marlin versus Klipper. And it's an interesting topic too because of what Klipper offers. But and as we all know, just as a comparison, Marlin gets pre-compiled using either Platform.io or some other compilation software of your choice. It used to be done in Android Studio. I don't know. You guys probably remember Android Studio. So if you're running 8-bit version motherboard,
wasn't it Arduino?
Oh yeah, Arduino. Sorry.
Yeah.
I have work projects on the brain. So Arduino Studio, and you can still do that if you really wanted to today. If you're compiling for an 8-bit, it will work. But you can still use VS Code, Platform.io. Or other options as well.
My preference is Platform.io. There's just you can edit it has such a nice interface. So yeah, I'm glad they kind of have moved that way.
Yeah, and I mean, on the topic of Platform.io and VS Code, VS Code is one of those things where VS Code is one of those things where it's a pretty plain editor that people built all those click-ins to, but like plugins. But like the auto build, Marlin auto build comes with Platform.io as a prereq now. So it's like you'll install one and it goes, "Do you want to install the other one?" It would be neat, and then you do, and it's great.
Yeah, and they're slowly like I've watched a few streams where they're evolving the auto build so that there will be, you can select your modules, let's say.
Yep.
You don't have to edit an uncomment code as much. You can actually just like, I have a BL Touch, I have this. Like they're working towards it being easier for people that aren't necessarily as tech savvy, shall we say?
And I mean, there are a lot of people in the hobby right now, a lot, right? And lots of them are new to the hobby. And one of the first things, unfortunately, a new person sees when they ask a question about their printer is, "Oh, that's not an issue. Just update your firmware and you'll be fine." And you say that to somebody that has like no experience, and it's like, oh, well, what do I do?
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
Man.
and to be fair, when you normally have a device, right, and you update your firmware, the device is predefined with certain components. So the firmware comes from the manufacturer and it is compatible with all those components, right?
Yep.
So you just literally flash it. Now with Marlin, because it covers such a large plethora of different types of hardware between 8-bit, 32-bit, different sensors and everything, and everyone can put them in as many configurations as possible. It's not that simple, right?
No.
You have to know exactly what you have.
Yep.
And if you're new to the terminology and printers and whatnot, you may not fully understand what you have to when you start out. So it can be a little daunting, right?
It's so like when it comes to like, this isn't Marlin, and we're gonna move past it, but like we've said it before too, like at a baseline, especially nowadays, like we're past the dark ages, but especially now, you should be able to open a 3D printer and just print with it for a while before you start monkeying or have the need to change firmware. You know, it's thankfully most of the safety features are on. If your printer has a BL Touch, they usually configure it properly now. Usually, Stig says, I've been looking for Marlin source for the Ender 3 Neo, but no luck. So the Ender 3 series is interesting, because you can, if you're going into the example file in Marlin specifically, you can just grab almost any of those, anyone that says Ender 3. I would start with the Ender 3 V2 for that one, because it is the same, and you just have to enable the probe.
Now they do have a slightly different screen on the Neo, so I don't know, as long as it's still.
Well, it's still DWin. I don't know.
Yes,
if
but it's a newer model of DWin. So
Yeah.
so as long as the latest build of Marlin is compatible with that version of the DWin screen, which I would think it is, then it should be fine. Like you should just be able to flash it, because it should be one of the 4 series of boards in there.
I'm just gonna check too. So
And
like, did you look in the nightlies? Stick there. The Neo has the old Ender style screen. No.
Oh, it's the Neo. I didn't think it did. I thought it had the new. Oh, or is there the Neo Pro?
Reality Ender 3 Neo. What did he? Sorry, I'm looking at it right now. Is it a V2 Neo? Is that what you got there? We can answer this question.
Yeah, because there's 2 versions of the Neo, right?
It has the D. It looks like the DWin screen off of the V2.
It's similar.
But anyway.
But there's Neo, and then there's the Neo V2.
If you go into the there's Ender. So if you go into the nightly build stick, here, hold on. Let me just switch the thing to this one.
And hopefully they can still hear me. Yeah. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. So as you can see from the screen, when he goes to the Marlin nightly builds and the configuration, there is both V2 Neo and then there's the other
Yeah.
Neo. So now my understanding is the V2 Neo has the D-Win screen, the other one has the classic screen. Now I know you don't like you said you didn't like the newer screen Stig, but the I didn't like it either, but once I flashed it, and you can actually take the screen off and you can flash it with newer software, you can make it look more like the classic Marlin screen and operate more like the classic Marlin screen, and it works actually really well. I really like it.
Stig's
So.
like, even though I didn't hear you, I got it. Nightly builds, yeah. Nightly builds have the new printers, and like, which is good, right? The only problem with nightly builds is now it's not a problem, but you venture into kind of like the alpha stream where
Right.
it's not long-term support. But you can also see from those build logs like when they might be rolling into the master branch, or
Right.
the main
And
release.
that's like continuing with our Marlin talk here. So it's evolved from version, 0 to version 1 to version, what is it,
1.19 was the last, and now we're at
1.19, right?
2.1.
And then the 2 series came out, and the big change from the 1 series to the 2 series was support for 32-bit architecture, right?
Yeah, and I mean printers. So like printers in general started doing 32-bit architecture. It, let's say late 2010s, right? Like it wasn't until
Yeah, it was like about
2018 they became starting to become popular,
yeah.
and then 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic, and in the start of the pandemic, everybody started really wanting them, but it was unfortunate because we had this pandemic and we had no chips and no
Well,
shipping
well,
and
well,
that stuff.
2018, you could put the beta version of Marlin on it, like as they were developing it. So
Yep.
you could still do 32-bit, but you were kind of bleeding edge at that point.
Yep.
And it only really became stable in 2019, just prior to pandemic and all
And
that.
so basically, when you look at Marlin's evolution, right? And like Rick said, we had 0, 1, 2. It wasn't until 2 that we had 32-bit controllers. And 2 has added more things like we were just
Oh
talking about
yeah,
with Stig, right? Like the biggest change that Marlin makes every release now is the fact that they're adding support for more hardware. So whether it's a printer or whether it's a stepper driver or a new kind of probe or a sensor, right? They they added they're adding now. They're in that phase where they're
yeah,
mature enough to just add.
yeah.
I think we
Between
can.
new features, like a lot of the mature features, pressure advance, for example,
Yeah.
right? They've added that support for a variety of different type of screens, right?
Yep.
Because everyone has a different choice there, right?
Yep.
Different types of other features. They keep adding more algorithms and
Yep.
different things into it to make it a more mature product.
Yep. And just like I'm gonna swing back a little bit because Raymond said it too. When you have a printer, and let's say we call our printer Bob, but Bob is the exact same as an Ender 3, but Bob is made by a competitor to Creality. You can still use the firmware from the example file for Bob. You just have to make sure that like the controller and that sort of thing are configured correctly for
Right.
the stepper drivers. So that's where it's like, oh well, if I know that this printer is 2209s, then I could still use the same build as this board and it's fine. I can get away with it. Maybe I need to change the maybe I have to change the microcontroller or the chipset, but
And maybe
yeah.
maybe maybe stepper direction,
And
stuff
once you
like that.
do get it, like, so I have some of my stuff that's on 2.04 still, here because it works and I don't want to move it. And then that's sticks at that too. Like with Marlin, it is nice. Unless there's a feature that you're like, man, I really, really wish I had pressure bands or something like that.
Right.
Right. You don't have to change because it's going to work. There's no problem. In fact, if you look at the marlinfirmware.org, the current release, long-term stable release is 2.0.9.5, not 2.1.2. Yeah, 2.07 actually worked really good. It fixed a lot of my acceleration issues. So that's kind of, let's call that our introduction spiel to Marlin. Yep. It's old, but it worked great and it's still developed.
Yeah, and it's well supported by the community, and any features that you have on your printer should be fully supported. So,
and mostly quickly too. Not too long. Now, Klipper. So Klipper is an interesting one because it actually has a few different it finds, once it loses its purpose, it finds purpose again. But Klipper was around 2016? Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
So Klipper came out in 2016, which my math is so good here. It's 5 years after Marlin. And Klipper was released to solve a problem with 8-bit controllers.
So, and potential of larger printers.
Well, that's kind of, yeah. So like its original intent was 8-bit, and then once 8-bit controllers went foof for the most part, and we had 32-bit, Klipper really found its home with people building large format printers that had many stepper drivers because prior, and I don't remember the release date for Marlin, but prior to, I want to say 2 point, like, I don't know, maybe 04, 05 in there. Marlin didn't have support for enough stepper drivers, and controller boards only came with usually 5, like until we saw the octopus, right? And so then Klipper stepped in and said, okay, well, I can control 2 controllers with 1 Raspberry Pi, and we can get all your motion system working and everything. Right?
It kind of bridged the gap between Marlin and Duet, because the Duet system, although it could do more stepper drivers, was very expensive. And then you could take 2 inexpensive 8-bit boards with 4 stepper drivers, and you could have 8 steppers on a printer if you wanted to, in theory, with Klipper. That was a very nice feature at the time, because Marlin, you were limited to maybe 5 stepper drivers.
Yeah.
Right.
And so when it comes to Klipper, and I'll talk about Marlin now a little bit with Klipper. So Marlin's built, like Greg said, on C++, and Klipper is built on C. So from a programming language perspective, from a programming language perspective, if you don't know, C is a procedural programming language, which basically means it's one big long if this, while everything's just one big long list of operations, which it works fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. However, C++ came about to solve a few problems and actually, hope in theory, run a little faster when it comes to compiling and reading. And it's an object-oriented programming language, so oop. and so like that's a really, do we need to know that? No, but technically C++ is more modern. So when we look at Klipper, it's an interesting choice, but it makes sense when you think about what Klipper is trying to achieve. Now, just Klipper at its base rate is a Raspberry Pi that was controlling basically an 8-bit, at the time when it first came out, an 8-bit controller. What's the problem with that statement right now?
Well, we have fairly powerful 32-bit controllers now that Marlin even has issue taking full control of because they're so powerful. Like
Right.
we're not as limited as now. Is there a problem with putting Klipper on a 32-bit board? No.
No.
But are you limited with the bottleneck that we had previously? No. So you can get away with running Marlin
Yeah, I don't even know if
on
I'd say get away with. I think Marlin's matured into it. You
yeah.
know what I
Oh
mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
you can run Marlin, like if you have some of these octopus boards or whatever, you can run Marlin in a Voron,
Right. And it works great.
and it'll work just fine. Now,
Um.
now there are other pieces that expand beyond Klipper and Marlin,
Mm-hmm.
that we should get into maybe in a later show or whatever, and,
Mm-hmm.
and explain, the Octoprints and the mainsail and fluids of the world that
Yeah.
tie them together. But right now we're just talking Klipper and Marlin, the actual
Yep.
firm.
So,
So
and actually, that's a good point about the firmware. When we talk about Marlin, Marlin can be and usually is driven from a screen controller that sits on your printer. Sorry, right? No, I'm not sorry about that. I don't want to say sorry. And Klipper, generally that screen goes foof, and you control it from, like Greg said, it'll be like a web interface. Even if you have like the control pad, the Sonic pad from Creality, that's still driving through a web interface and sending the commands.
yeah, and technically that's like either mainsail or Klipper, or
Yep.
mainsail
Fluid.
or fluid
Yeah.
on the. I can't remember which one's on the Sonic pad, but
Yeah. I
I'm sure
forget.
there's
There's a
there's
big Tree Tech Sonic pack now too. I saw it the other day.
oh
So
really?
they have more hardware. Gasp. The other problem, and it's not a problem, but the other thing is buy a Raspberry Pi nowadays.
Try to.
So I haven't tried, and I was looking online last night, and I found a few replacements. And I know somebody mentioned one
So
in the comment here, but you can run other SBCs for Klipper using fluid or mainsail, as long as you can get the right build on it. So like there's a microcontroller called a Le Potato. And it's a clone basically of a Raspberry Pi, and actually it sits between the Raspberry Pi 4 and 3
okay,
for
for
speed,
performance wise, yeah.
and they're $50.
Yeah, so there's lots of different things out there. Pierre also was asking about, yeah, you don't need to run Klipper on any printer. You can run Marlin on any printer. It doesn't matter if it's a Voron or a Rat Rig or whatever.
Yep.
You can run a Duet. I know people who have put a Duet, which is different. We haven't talked about them, but they're more expensive and whatnot. But you can run any printer off of those, right? Like it doesn't matter what controller is in it. But we're focused on firmware here. That's
Yeah.
kind of what we're looking at.
And yeah, like Greg says, anything's good. To be clear, like, and we'll get into this when we start configuring. But like Marlin and Klipper differ a little bit because Klipper has more control in the config file. That it's a text format file that you can save onto the Raspberry Pi and all the config reads from that. Versus Marlin, which a lot of the config you can change from the EEPROM still, right? You can write the EEPROM settings, but you do have less after control in Marlin than you do in Klipper. So
right. So like if you add a feature or need to change a stepper direction or modify something to do with a probe, you can do that in a text file. Whereas in Marlin, you'll have to recompile. A lot of the smaller stuff now is exposed and can be saved in the EEPROM settings, but not everything. Like there's a lot of stuff that I expose a lot of that so I can tweak. Like for now, if you have a UART based board, you
Yeah.
can now tweak your TMC driver voltages and whatnot on the fly, right? Whereas before you'd have to recompile it each time to do that. But
Yeah.
over time, Marlin has exposed that as values that you can turn on in the menu so that you can
Yep.
now have finer grain control. And Klipper allows you to do that as well. But they do it through,
I-
like David said, text
yeah.
files. Again, stored in the Raspberry Pi. And they have different interfaces to access those. You can access it through, a command prompt and use like Emacs Vi or whatever you want
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to modify those text files.
Did you just
Or
say Vi? Don't make
yes,
me come over there.
I like. What's wrong with Vi?
Everybody knows you have to suffer through Nano. That's the only option.
And we're getting nerdy, but
Yeah.
so there are differences, but feature wise, they're feature very similar. Like they're not both exact. There are things that are done differently in the Klipper world than the Marlin world.
And again, so we've said it a few times, but I'll say it one more time because I want to say it one more time. You might have an opinion on which one is better, and I want to say they both work fine. I do think like Marlin matured past a point where, again, like we when we started talking Klipper, we talked about how Klipper had an original intent to take those 8-bit controllers and do the processing on the faster Raspberry Pi. And now that we've moved past that point where the controllers were a little bit lacking in memory, right? Like, Greg, do you remember? I'm sure you do. You there's many a times in the olden days where
In the past,
where you'd go to compile. Dang it! Come on, screen. Where you go to compile firmware, and then it would say, "You don't have enough room for this."
Oh yes.
No,
The 8-bit boards were notorious where you would get like a BL touch or a sensor.
Yep.
Then you would go through and start compiling stuff, and then all of a sudden it'd be like, I'm sorry, I only have like, I can't remember even how many K it was, but it wasn't large enough to be able to have all the features turned on. So then you'd have to like turn on slim menus, or you'd have to say, okay, I don't need this, I don't need that.
The trade-off, right?
And
I guess
it
I
was,
can't use S-curve acceleration.
right. It was just, it could be frustrating. Then slowly the 8-bit boards got the larger, the mega chip, right? That was that had a lot more memory on it, so you could turn on more features. But again, you could run out. So when we started using SD cards and got the 32-bit boards, you could address more memory, right? That's the big thing with 32 or 64-bit computers nowadays, right?
Yeah.
When you make that jump from 8 to 32 or 8 to 16 to 32 to 64, your addressable memory range of usable RAM now goes way up. So and it more than doubles. Right?
Yeah.
It's not like, oh well, it goes up significantly. And so now you didn't have that limitation that you had before, and you can now turn on every feature, which I don't know if I'd recommend doing that. But
I mean, if you do that, you run into issues like we ran into in Marlin, where like everything prints fine. Why is this top service or surface weird? It's because you've turned on like conflicting settings. It's like,
well, and that's something you learn as you go, right? Like, yeah, they have all these additional settings in there, but you have to know what they do, and you have to know, are they compatible? Like, what's the new feature that they have, David, that we could never remember the name of? It's basically,
it's not pressure advance.
no, it's the harmonics one.
I can't remember.
Anyway, so if you have certain features on right now, they're not compatible. Like if you have ARC, is it ARC on? And
Yeah,
or S curve,
S curve,
S curve,
it's S
and
curve.
like you'll get weird stuff happening, right?
Yeah, because both
So
of them deal with acceleration, and then their math
right.
goes.
Yeah, so you have dueling algorithms that are trying to do the same thing, but at the same time when they should be doing them separately. And so then it just like freaks out, and then you get weird results. So so those are things that over time, Marlin will then put checks and balances in, so it'll warn you when it try to build it. No, if
Yeah,
you're using this feature, you can't, because that's one thing that has improved is the error reporting when you go to compile,
yeah.
and you've turned on a feature, and well, you turn on a feature that you want, and then you go to compile it and it says, oh, you've turned on this feature. It will not work unless you also to do X. Because
It's yeah.
Y won't work if unless X is there, or you can't have X and Y at the same time. You must turn off this. So, and the language on the error reporting has become a lot more human readable. It's not, you don't have to try to um, delve into some of the README files deep into the code in some of the source files and whatnot to figure out what the heck's going on anymore.
Yeah.
Where before it was a little more difficult in that respect.
So,
But they have really worked hard
mhm.
on cleaning that up.
And if you run, so there's a few different error levels in Marlin, and when you compile, and like either they will say sanity,
Right.
sanity health, or it'll be an error and a failure. Sanity, sometimes you can just do it and it'll still work. Um, so the feature is called input shaping.
Yes.
You're
Yeah.
welcome. I looked it up.
I don't know
Just,
why I
like
have a so
so
hard time.
and here's an
Linear
example of
advanced
something.
input shaping. It's yeah.
And it's an example. That's an example of something Klipper does, right? That Marlin picked up on. Except they use accelerometers right now,
Yes.
in Klipper, and that's one thing. So going back to like Klipper and features, Klipper does have features that still exist outside of Marlin, and like they kind of exist in this like their
They
relationship
different
is.
techniques
Yeah, so
basically.
like they one will come out with one thing called input shaping, the other one's like, well, we have that, but it's this, which uses this. It's not like a slicer where we're starting to see like, I have tree supports. Okay, I'll just take yours, right? Like they
Right.
still these still work separately. The one thing, and again, that I think Klipper has matured into is we don't have the need to control 8-bit controllers anymore with like and we're not lacking feature sets, right? Because we have 32-bit controllers for the most part with a lot of memory, unless you manage to get yourself like one of the original SKR like E3 dip boards, and I'm
But
sorry if you
but
have one, but
if you have a whole bunch of 8-bit boards kicking around, and you
yeah.
want to build a massive printer with a whole, you want to, let's say you want to build a Voron with a whole bunch of independent steppers and whatnot, and you need like 6 to 8 steppers or whatever. You can do that with all your old 8-bit boards, and they don't even have to be the same model of 8-bit board. That's the neat thing, right? Because you put the custom firmware on it,
Mm-hmm.
you just define them. Now, for example, my Zero over here, Voron, I have a second board on it. Why do I have a second board? I needed another thermistor for my, because I wanted to have
Mm-hmm.
uh, temperature of the actual enclosure, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to get the ambient temperature when you're printing. And so I basically, the only thing I'm using off of that board, I had to do firmware and everything, is the thermistor.
I mean, yeah, the other thing, so using a Raspberry Pi with Klipper means you actually have access to the Pi GPIO too, so you could hook a thermistor to the Pi,
Yes.
um,
Yeah,
and
you
then use
could.
the Pi. But like same thing, that you have to configure both. But like, I mean, the actual days of like, do I have a few 8-bit boards? I have two now that didn't just die and they're gone, right? And I think now when we're looking at Klipper, it's they moved into the niche like you just said, and you used the example like where you have two boards, right? But again, the hang up for Klipper right now is how do you find, if you don't already have one, and you mentioned like Octoprint and stuff before, but like if you don't already have a Raspberry Pi or a compatible SBC, you're gonna run into
it's difficult.
issues,
Yeah,
right?
and
Like,
that's why the big tree techs of the world came out with their Manta boards with their clone of a Pi. It's not using the Raspberry Pi processor that they use on all theirs. It's using an alternative, so that they could do the same thing and be able to run Klipper. So that's another part where Klipper, you're not limited to a Pi necessarily, as long as you can run it. I'm sure you could, anything with you do need your PIO and whatnot, I'm sure, to do some more of the advanced stuff. So as long as your little microcontroller that you're using, whether it's a banana Pi or a Raspberry Pi or an orange Pi or a potato or the what is it, CH4 or whatever the one is
chip.
from Big Tree Tech, as long as it's compatible and they have a build for it, Klipper will run.
And I think that like in this process we will find a replacement board that will work for Klipper, and they're probably, I'm hoping it's the La Potato, because then we can recommend this $50 board, which would be great. Now,
supposedly this fall the Pi shortage will be done.
Sure, I'll believe it when I see it. So all that being said, though, when you look at Klipper, in theory, the maximum speed of which it can process printing directives is slightly faster still than just a single 32-bit controller. Slightly. Yes, Dick, I think that was your problem. But so when you look at the actual right, Gary, air quotes, end of shortage. Oops, I just mashed my space bar. Sorry about that. Anyway, when you look at the actual computational speed, though, we've seen things like arc welding in Klipper, or not Klipper, in Marlin, sorry. Yeah. And like you had to turn on arc support, and everybody's like, wow, arc support, this is great, right? Oh, wow, it works great. It does work great, by the way. Yeah. But like that's an example of a higher load computational stress that's actually easy.
It smooths things out,
right?
Yeah.
And your controller, just the controller.
Don't do it on an 8-bit board.
No, no. Right. And there is a similar thing on Klipper as well. And so that's this trade-off back and forth. I am interested. I'd love to know why on Klipper would they wrote it in C and not something like Python.
Well, and that's when you start getting into the other pieces, whether it's the Moonraker API or the Fluid and Clip and that sort of thing. Those environments are now built on a different platform that interfaces with it, right? Yeah. And I don't know, because when you compile your firmware, right, it's using C or C++ to compile a firmware.bin file, which then is compatible with the appropriate, chip set that your controller has. Like that itself is the output from C or C++. It's not C or C++. It's compatible with the chip environment that it is. So these are just tools to get to that point to make it workable on the controller. So it doesn't really matter whether it was Python or C++ or C and whatnot, as long as the end result gets you where you want to go.
It's true. Now, there's one more thing that I think we should talk about before we get to the top of the hour, which we are very quickly approaching.
Yeah.
and this one comes down to ease of use. So when it comes, so we know
That's
that,
a difficult one.
right? Because we know both of them have, like, you can use Octoprint as an interface to a Klipper, or you can use Fluid or Mainsail or Clippy, right? So from that standpoint, let's say all of them have a Raspberry Pi web interface.
Right.
So I think we
Now,
can wash that out.
like there is a difference between using Octoprint
Yeah.
and Fluid or Mainsail with Klipper though.
Oh, definitely.
Because the communication's different. Like
It is.
and maybe that's in the next series that we talk about when we get more into the GUI side.
Yeah, I think that's something we leave to next time. We'll keep it higher level this time and just, yeah, like they have it. But like from the standpoint of, and we've seen this before a few times. So like Marlin, and like we were talking with Stig earlier, right? Oh, they don't have support for this board, so I have to go and find it. And then, oh, it turns out it's a nightly build. Okay, perfect, right? But what do you always have to do with Marlin to update your firmware? You always have to go back and you recompile it in VS Code and Platform IO, and then you get the firmware bin file, and if it's on a SKR controller or similar, most controllers you can just slap that in.
How about most modern 32-bit controllers?
Yeah, except Creality for some reason.
Creality too.
No, you have to rename the file.
Oh, okay.
You can't. So on a Creality printer, you can't use firmware.bin if it was the last thing flashed. You have to keep changing the name.
Yeah, you can't use the previous names file. Yeah,
and so
that's a goofy thing.
And then once the firmware loads, you might want to run an M502, depending, because if you have a board, for example, like the E3 Turbo from Big Tree Tech that has a onboard EEPROM, it might remember old settings.
More and more of the newer boards have an onboard EEPROM. Just so
it's
that
good practice, right?
Yeah, because I've never really had too much trouble because the earlier SKR boards, for example, the 1.3 and 1.4, they used a virtual EEPROM.
Yeah. Whereas
and I never really had too much problems with it, but a lot of people had kind of the virtual EEPROM would corrupt, and then you'd have to kind of wipe it and reload it and whatnot.
Yeah, and mine was never corrupt. It's just sometimes it wouldn't remember. Like you'd flash the new firmware and then you'd look and it still said your old like offset values and stuff like that. And the M502 fixes that, and then just an M500 writes it back to the EEPROM. Now, flip that over. If you want to recompile Klipper, what do, right? Like you
don't, unless there's some sort of bug in the firmware, you don't have to reflash your board typically.
No, right? You update the text file if you want to change a setting.
You just tweak it. Now, unless there's a new feature, if there's a new feature or a new there was a bug in the way that the firmware talked to the controller, because it's basically just here I've got 5 steppers, I've got 3 thermistors, and I've got whatever. Like that's it. And I'm sending commands just to those things. I'm not processing anything on the board. I'm just now telling my Pi is telling those pieces do that move. Right? Whereas the old way of doing it is the firmware is sitting on the board and you send your print to the board, and it's now has to process each command on the board to move the steppers and whatnot, and layer by layer or whatever.
Right. And like, so it's important to remember, and like Gary brought up the point, is there's many ways to move the firmware, Marlin firmware, or the text files back and forth to a printer and edit them. And that's not what we're here to judge. Like I do like the firmware upload tool. I did a video on using
I've done
FTP.
I've done it over from Octoprint. There was a tool where you could then put your firmware in, and it could flash it that way. You can connect your printer to your PC and flash it that way. There's a number of ways of doing it. The connection from your PC to your board, well, that used to be problematic, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't have bootloaders.
Nope. and then like the original firmwares that were coming out weren't actually letting you mount the SD card, which made it really hard to interface with it other than putting the SD card in the printer, right? So
Yeah.
that's a
things,
firmware change, thankfully.
Things have modernized and simplified, which is very nice.
Yes. Now, as far as like, and this is going to be a crappy answer, but for ease of installation, I think both of them are relatively the same. I think ease of post configuration, though.
Okay. So
that's
firmware wise,
yeah.
The flashing process equally similar.
Yep.
Right. But when you flash the firmware for Marlin, you're done.
Yeah, and that's the key. And
right?
that is the key. So there's no more.
If you just flash Klipper firmware,
you're not done.
And you have not configured any of your default config files,
yep.
You are going to be pretty frustrated when you can't connect your printer from your Pi.
Yeah, absolutely, you would be.
Right. And I had the issue when I got started with Klipper is, you get the Klipper firmware flashed, but then you have to figure out the right connection string for this board to connect, and then you connect, but then you have to then define every stepper driver, it took some configuring. Now, have they streamlined it to make that base starter set that you need for your board better? Yes,
they have,
and there's some tools to do that, and we'll actually have to talk about that because that's a little more technical. But once you compile Marlin, you just can print.
Yeah, and not saying like like we've ran into lots of issues where like you go to compile Marlin and then it's like, oh, right now the repository that has your chipset is down, so you can't compile right now.
Yeah,
right.
And that could be a firewall issue on your local network. It could be their actually repository is like literally down. Offline, like it's been hacked. Who knows? Like you don't know. Because is Corelity updating it and you can't get access to that at the time
or whatever.
Yeah.
So like there are issues with both, and like if you incorrectly flash a firmware once, sometimes it can be very hard. Like we had a case where some new firmware went out and they just couldn't print anymore. So and then eventually we just flashed like the basic stock firmware back to it, and it actually brought it back to life, which was great. Because it's not very often now that you can brick a controller when you're flashing like Marlin or to it, or even the base Klipper set. But like it's important. So like the difference, I think, just high level again between Klipper and Marlin. When you flash the firmware, Marlin has all of the stuff pre-configured. Klipper is just waiting for the control set to be added to it, right?
Yeah.
Like it's more of a receiver at that point than an actual controller.
Stig threw a thing into Discord asking if this was the board you were looking at, and it's the La Potato. And it is on Amazon.
Yes, that's the board.
In Canadian dollars. It's right now $35.
No, that's
for 2 gig.
Is that American or Canadian?
No, I'm on. Ooh,
you're calm.
I'm calm.
It's 53 Canadian, but it's 35 American. I was looking at them last night, and the other cool part is you can actually start bundling them up too, right? So you can save yourself a little money if you buy like a 2-pack.
Oh, it's way more expensive in Canadian.
It's $53.
It's $78 for the 2 gig in Canadian.
Canadians always getting the shaft, I tell you.
But if you only need a 1 gig, it's
Stig did post the La Potato. You know what? I'd probably order it with my American MasterCard and just get it in at the other price. But anyway, that's not the point. The Le Potato is actually still pretty cheap, and for our intents and purposes, you could probably end up buying the gig, like for fluid and octoprint and stuff. You don't need.
It's pretty fast too.
I
Looking
mean, the
at
actual
the
exchange
specs of it.
rates. I don't even remember. I think we've closed the weekend at 73 cents. Was the exchange, so that's why we're probably looking at that. But
Yeah, no,
there are some.
it looks pretty sweet. So yeah, if you are looking at a pie alternative, we're gonna have to get one and test it and whatnot.
We should.
But
Yeah.
speaking of posting in Discord, like
Hold on, you're doing it.
like
dear.
Stig has or other people have. I mean, we should thank a certain.
I pushed the button already. You're segued.
So I would just like to thank everyone that is in our Discord and whatnot, and to be a part of that, you can join us on Patreon, and there are a variety of levels you can join us at. But one of the perks, like we've talked about, is the Discord. We also do our live stream once a month, and you can join us live, and we can interact and chat with you online with everyone else, or you can talk to us all the time in our Discord. So please join us, and thank you to everyone, Hilge at the top level and everyone else, because you make these kind of streams and stuff possible, and it's great to interact with everyone and be able to like do cool stuff like that. So thanks.
Thank you, everybody, and you might even make it possible for some Le Potato to show
that's true.
Right?
That's
like,
true.
I think the gig, like I'm just looking at the
Gig-
because like a gig will do your octoprint or fluid, right? And that's kind of the 2 gig. Yeah, like obviously
now
more expensive.
It looks like it's a similar processor to the Raspberry Pi. So is it?
You can
do you
flash
think
Raspberry into it.
You can. So it's fully Raspberry compatible.
Yeah, because the Raspberry
That's
Pi 4
interesting.
uses the Cortex A73 processor set, and this one has
A53.
And this, so they're both Cortex in the A series, so it should work fine. But yes, this one, it's an interesting space where this board sits.
They use a different GPU though, so I bet you if you did anything,
it can use CUDA core.
Yeah, because
it can do video rendering better than the Pi.
It's interesting. It does 4K 60. Interesting. So it's an interesting alternative. It's nice to see that even though there's a shortage, people have been trying to fill in the gaps, shall we say.
And there are other ones that we mentioned. Like the Orange Pi is more expensive than this. It's about double the price.
And there's the banana. There's a few, right?
But
they tried to use all the fruit.
Yeah, they rotate through. Like it's crazy because you can get the 4-pack in Canadian money for $200. Like what is that?
I want to know why they call it La Potato.
Le Potato. That's how you have to say it too. Okay, everybody,
Potato.
Please remember when you say the word, listen to our voices. Le Potato. Love it. All right, but we have reached the top of the hour, so I hope that you enjoyed the initial dive into Marlin and Klipper. This will be made available as podcast format. We'll see how the audio sounds. We might have to tweak the next one. So you can find that at the 3D Make It podcast. You just search 3D Make It on all your podcasting apps and you'll find it. I'll probably have it out later today. So,
yay.
And other than that, we will jump in. Dominic, I'm hoping for a chocolate cream pie. We will.
Bye.
Next week we'll start tackling more of the configuration one, and next week, if my math is correct, too, is a Patreon. Next month. So next week we'll kind of do a Patreon stream for that hour. So we'll make sure that like all the Patreons have first dibs at the questions and stuff. But we will do a very high level because going in deep is going to take a while, but we will kind of go through the compile process.
Well,
And
there's going to be a
troubleshoot it.
number of different streams, because I mean, you can have I think we have to go into, Octoprint talking about the differences and the connections, and then, then go into, some of the other more technical connection pieces to Klipper and whatnot.
It's going to be a wild and bumpy ride.
That'll be fun.
love
As long as everyone's learning along the way, right? So,
Yep. But we shall say goodbye, friends.
bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us in chat.
See you later. Have a